The easiest way to dismiss a black woman in a hospital is to call her emotional the moment her urgency becomes inconvenient. Nurse Danielle Brooks had heard that word before, not always out loud, not always in meetings, sometimes just in the glance that followed after she spoke too quickly about a patient trend no one else had noticed yet, sometimes in the tight smile from a physician who preferred confidence from her in smaller doses, sometimes in the way concern became tone the moment it came from a black nurse who was right more often than the room found comfortable. So when the attending physician on 6 South told her to take a breath and stop being so emotional about bed 12, Danielle didn't argue, not at first, because she had already learned one of the hardest truths in medicine. If people do not trust your instincts, sometimes the patient has to get sicker before they trust your evidence. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories about dignity, justice, and moments when the truth arrives on a monitor no one can talk over, subscribe and stay with me. St. Catherine's Medical Center was the kind of hospital that looked calm from the outside and ran on controlled chaos inside. 12 floors, constant fluorescent light, hallways that smelled like sanitizer, stale coffee, and whatever fear leaves behind when it stays in the walls too long. Monitors chirped, wheels rattled, phones rang. Somewhere, always, somebody was trying not to lose a patient and somebody else was trying not to lose control of the shift. Danielle Brooks had worked cardiac step-down for 7 years. She was 35, sharp, composed, and the kind of nurse other nurses quietly looked for when the floor started turning ugly. She did not waste movement. She charted cleanly, watched people carefully, and knew the difference between a patient who looked uncomfortable and a patient whose body was starting to leave them clues. Her coworkers trusted her because she was good. Patients trusted her because she told them the truth without making it feel like a threat. Doctors trusted her too, most of the time. Most of the time was not always enough. Bed 12 was Mr. Harold Levin, 68, admitted after chest pain and shortness of breath. Initial workup suggested non-ST elevation cardiac ischemia, complicated by electrolyte imbalance. He was stable on paper. Not well, not ready for discharge, but stable enough that day shift had him categorized as watch closely, intervene if trend changes. Danielle inherited him at 6:58 p.m. from a day nurse already halfway into her jacket. Troponins elevated but drifting down, the nurse said. Potassium borderline. He's been anxious all afternoon. Complained of fluttering once, but telemetry didn't show anything dramatic. Cardiology says monitor overnight. Danielle nodded and kept reading. Then she saw the rhythm strips. Nothing spectacular. That was the problem. A little irregularity. A subtle widening in a beat cluster. A recovery pattern she did not like. She walked into the room. Mr. Levin was pale in that grayish way heart patients sometimes get when the body is trying to stay polite about a worsening problem. His wife sat in the recliner by the window, with a paperback open but unread in her lap. He smiled when Danielle introduced herself, but his breathing looked more deliberate than relaxed, and his left hand kept drifting toward the blanket as if he were waiting for something unpleasant to return. How are you feeling? Danielle asked. Fine, he said automatically. His wife said, he's not. Danielle smiled softly. Tell me the honest version. Mr. Levin shifted. It's like my heart keeps missing and then catching up. They told me the monitor looked okay. Did the feeling stop? Not really. Danielle checked the telemetry lead placement herself, then the pulse. Slightly irregular, skin cool. She asked about nausea. He said a little. Dizziness, a little. Chest pain. Not pain exactly. Pressure comes and goes. Then he looked at her and said the sentence she never ignored. Something feels wrong. People love machines in hospitals. Machines make things legible. But experienced nurses know there are moments when a patient says something is wrong in a tone no monitor has caught up to yet, and that tone matters. Danielle stepped out and pulled up his live monitor history. There. Brief rhythm variability. Too short for the day team to panic over. Too consistent for her to dismiss. She paged the resident covering 6 South. Dr. Evan Mercer arrived 6 minutes later. White coat open, expression already tired in the way residents often are near shift turnover when they suspect concern will turn out to be paperwork. He was white, early 30s, smart enough to know medicine, not yet seasoned enough to know how often nurses save doctors from their own confidence. "What's going on?" he asked. Danielle handed him the chart tablet. Mr. Levin in 12 says he's still feeling intermittent pressure and fluttering. His telemetry trend is changing. I want repeat labs, stat EKG, and someone from cardiology loop back in. Mercer glanced at the screen. This? Yes. He looked again, then shrugged lightly. Could be artifact. Could be anxiety. His electrolytes were only mildly off. Danielle kept her tone even. It's not just the strip. He looks worse than he did on admission photos, and he says the sensation never really stopped. Mercer exhaled. Danielle, patients on this floor always feel like something's wrong. Sometimes because something is. He gave her the tired smile some men use when they think they're being patient with a woman's intensity. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm not ahead. I'm on time. That sharpened him slightly. He looked back at the monitor, then toward the room, then at her again. I'll order the EKG if it makes you feel better. If it makes you feel better. There it was. Not clinical judgment, emotional accommodation. Danielle said, order the labs too. He hesitated. There's no indication for stat repeat enzymes yet. Then electrolytes and magnesium. Mercer's mouth tightened. You're being a little reactive. She held his gaze. No, I'm being observant. He looked annoyed now, and annoyance in hospitals often means male authority has begun translating female certainty into attitude. All right, he said, EKG, basic labs. But please stop escalating every borderline rhythm change into a crisis. Danielle said nothing, because correcting the sexism in the sentence would not protect the patient faster than getting the orders in. The EKG tech came. The tracing was not clean enough to indict anyone. Non-specific changes, concerning if you wanted them to be, dismissible if you didn't. Mercer glanced at it and seemed relieved. See, he said, nothing actionable right now. Danielle looked at the paper. Nothing comforting either. He gave a short, humorless laugh. You know, not everything is an emergency. Then he lowered his voice just enough to make the insult sound private instead of structural. You're getting too emotional about this. That sentence stayed very still in the air between them. For a moment, Danielle did not move. Not because she was wounded, because she was tired of how often black women in medicine had to absorb disrespect and keep translating it into patient care anyway. Then she said, I'll chart that I voice concern. Mercer frowned. Excuse me. I said I'll chart that I voice concern. He stared at her for one beat, then looked away first. Do whatever you need to do. So she did. 1942. RN notes continued patient complaint of intermittent chest pressure and palpitations. Subtle telemetry variability reviewed. Covering physician notified. Request made for repeat evaluation in stat labs. Clean, factual, permanent. At 8:11 p.m., Mr. Levin's potassium came back lower than before. Not catastrophic. Worse. Danielle paged Mercer again. He called back instead of coming in person. Replace potassium per protocol, he said. I want bedside reassessment. Why? Because your patient looks like he is running out of margin, she wanted to say. Instead, she said, because the rhythm isn't settling. Mercer was quiet for half a second. Then with unmistakable irritation, Danielle, you cannot run every patient by fear. Follow the protocol. I'm not using fear. I'm using pattern recognition. Another silence. Then he said, take a breath. I'll check in after my admission upstairs. That was the second time he told her to calm down. The second time he reframed urgency as feeling. Danielle hung up without answering and went back into room 12. Mr. Levin now looked worse, not dramatically. That was still the danger. He had that damp look, forehead slightly sweaty, speech still intact but shorter, pressure in his chest now. Not pain, but not pain. His wife stood as soon as Danielle came in. He's changing, she said quietly. I know. Do they know? Danielle looked at her. I'm working on it. She increased monitoring, adjusted his position, repeated vitals, and stayed close enough to catch what came next. At 8:26 p.m., the monitor caught 3 quick premature ventricular beats, then quiet. Then 5 minutes later, another cluster. Danielle's eyes narrowed. She stepped into the hall and looked at central telemetry herself. Now the pattern was there. Small, escalating, ugly in possibility, if not yet in form. The charge nurse, Felicia Grant, came up beside her. Felicia was black too, older, and one of the few people on the unit who could read Danielle's face like chart notes. "What do you have?" Danielle pointed. "11 and 12. He's changing. Mercer thinks I'm overcalling it." Felicia studied the strip. "That's not artifact." "No. You call rapid?" "Not yet." Felicia looked through the room window at Mr. Levin, then back at the monitor. "You're close." Danielle nodded. "I know." At 8:33 p.m., Mercer finally came down. He walked into the room with the look of a man prepared to perform reassurance more than medicine. He listened to the chest, asked a few questions, checked the chart again. Then he straightened and said, "We'll replace electrolytes, continue monitor, and page cardiology if there's a significant event." Danielle stared at him. "This is the significant event." He looked at her, now openly annoyed. "No, this is you trying to make one." Mrs. Levin heard that. So did Felicia, standing in the doorway. So did the patient. It was one of those terrible hospital moments where the hierarchy becomes visible enough to make the room colder. Danielle said very evenly, "He has ongoing symptoms, worsening rhythm irregularity, low potassium, and clinical deterioration." Mercer gestured lightly toward the monitor. "He is not crashing." "No," Danielle said. "He is warning." Mercer rubbed a hand over his face. "Danielle, please. You are too emotionally invested in this patient." There it was again. Louder now. Public. Mrs. Levin looked between them, frightened. Felicia's face went hard. Danielle could feel the heat in her chest, but she kept her voice flat enough to survive later retelling. "I'm invested in him staying alive." Mercer opened his mouth to answer, and the monitor changed. Everyone in the room heard it at once. The tone, not the ordinary heartbeat chirp, the sharper sound. The rhythm on the screen shifted in one ugly, unmistakable jump. Wide, complex run, fast, wrong. Mr. Levin gasped and grabbed the blanket. Danielle moved before anyone else. "Call rapid response now." Felicia was already on it. Mercer turned toward the monitor, and whatever he had been about to say died in his throat. Because now the machine had set it for her. The strip ran longer. Ventricular tachycardia. Sustained. Mr. Levin's color dropped. His pressure tanked. His wife cried out his name. Danielle was at bedside with oxygen, lowering the rails, checking responsiveness. Voice clear and hard now. "Mr. Levin, stay with me. Stay with me." Rapid response alarms began spilling into the hallway. Footsteps. Crash cartwheels. Someone calling cardiology stat. Respiratory entering at speed. Mercer stood there for 1 second too long, frozen not by ignorance but by the horror of being caught wrong at exactly the worst moment. Then training re-entered his body and he snapped into motion. But by then the room already knew. The nurse he called emotional had been on time. The monitor had simply arrived late enough for everyone else to feel safe first. The rapid team swarmed. Pads placed, IV line checked, labs rushed, cardiology fellow sprinting in half-button jacket, antiarrhythmics ordered, transfer prep shouted over the sound of the monitor and Mr. Levin's ragged breaths. Danielle stayed where experienced nurses stay in chaos, close enough to matter, quiet enough not to waste the room, essential enough that no one could pretend the crisis had begun without her. The rhythm broke after intervention, then threatened again, then stabilized just enough to move. They got him to ICU, alive. That mattered. Everything else came after. The hallway outside room 12 was still vibrating with emergency when Felicia turned to Mercer and said, not loudly, "She told you." Mercer said nothing. He looked like a man trying to stand inside his white coat without feeling how thin it had become. Danielle charted the event with the same precision she had charted the warnings. 2041. Telemetry change to sustained wide complex tachyarrhythmia. Rapid response initiated. Patient symptomatic with hypotension and worsening chest pressure. Transferred ICU after bedside stabilization. Then, because she believed in complete records, she added, prior concerns regarding trend change communicated to covering physician on multiple occasions before event. No adjectives, no revenge, just truth with a timestamp. By the end of the shift, everyone on 6 South knew, not gossip first, fact. Danielle called it, Mercer minimized it, the monitor proved it. And hospitals, like all institutions, are full of people who pretend not to notice bias until a patient nearly dies in its shadow. The formal review happened 2 days later. Conference room, risk management, nurse manager, medical director, Mercer, Danielle. Felicia as witness. The medical director, a white man who had spent 20 years practicing calm authority, reviewed the timeline aloud. Initial complaints, rhythm concerns, nurse escalation, repeat communication, rhythm change, rapid response. Then he looked at Mercer. Why was cardiology not paged earlier? Mercer shifted in his chair. The objective findings were limited. Danielle said, the objective findings were changing. No one corrected her. The medical director looked at the chart again. Nurse Brooks documented concern 3 separate times. Yes, and told you the patient was warning. Mercer's jaw moved. Yes. The nurse manager, Cynthia Alvarez, turned to Danielle. Is there anything you want added to the record? Danielle could have said many things. About tone, about how often black women get told to calm down when urgency comes from them instead of white men. About the cost of making instinct prove itself twice. Instead, she said, I want it recorded that being dismissed as emotional delayed the response to a genuine clinical change. That line sat in the room exactly as it should have, because sometimes a sentence is not angry. It is merely too accurate to dodge. The review resulted in a formal note for Mercer, escalation protocol reinforcement, a mandatory communication training module nobody would enjoy, and everybody would pretend was about teamwork instead of hierarchy and race. But the real consequence happened on the floor. People changed, not all at once, not enough, but noticeably. Residents stopped a little longer when Danielle called. The unit secretary began saying, if Danielle's paging you twice, just come. Even nurses from other sections started asking, can you look at this strip, when something smelled wrong before it looked wrong. Mr. Levin came back to the step-down floor 4 days later after ICU stabilization and successful intervention. He was weaker, palely grateful, alive in the ordinary miraculous way medicine sometimes allows when enough people move in time. His wife hugged Danielle before she could stop her. You knew, Mrs. Levin said. Danielle smiled faintly. I listened. Mr. Levin, voice still rough, said, you were the only one who looked scared before everyone else started acting. That stayed with her, because it was true, and because fear was not the right word, not exactly. She had not been scared. She had been certain in a room that treated certainty from her-like feeling. A week later, Mercer found her at the med cart near shift change. He looked exhausted, chastened, and deeply uncomfortable in the way men do when apology requires stepping around their own self-image. I owe you one, he said. Danielle kept scanning meds. You owe the patient one. He nodded. Yes. A pause, then. I was wrong. She looked at him then. Not cold, not warm, just level. Yes, she said. He swallowed. I shouldn't have called you emotional. No, she said. You shouldn't have. Another pause. I'm trying to learn from it. Danielle slid the drawer shut. Then next time, she said, don't wait for the monitor to make my concern legible to you. That was the closest thing to mercy he got, and it was enough. The version most people would tell was simple. A black nurse warned them. A doctor dismissed her as too emotional. The monitor caught the rhythm change and proved she was right. But the truer version was harder. A black woman recognized danger early because she knew her patient and knew the pattern. A white physician heard urgency in her voice and translated it into temperament instead of judgment. A man got sicker in the space between warning and belief, and only when the machine cried out in a language everybody respected did the room finally stop calling her emotional and start calling rapid response. That is what prejudice often looks like in hospitals. Not always open hostility, sometimes just delayed trust, a softer dismissal, a calmer insult, A woman told to breathe while the patient's body is already beginning to shout, until the monitor catches the rhythm change. And then suddenly the same concern that sounded too emotional becomes exactly what should have been heard the first time. If this story moved you, like the video, subscribe and stay close. There are more stories like this one waiting.